you're serving cold coffee and hot coffee, and you have these like Starbucks mugs, and like it's quite cool. Like I got a mug once from Bloomberg that basically changed color when there's a hot water in it.
My name, everyone, is Yatharth, and I am a consultant at BCG. I'll be playing the role of the interviewer for this case.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eishan. I'm a consultant at Bain in the London office, and I'm going to be playing the role of the interviewee in this case. Looking forward.
Awesome. So let's get started, Ishan. Your client is a mid-sized German chemical conglomerate manufacturing intermediaries and end products used primarily in the construction industry. The company operates a number of diverse segments, including performance polymers, rubber, adhesives, paints and coatings. Although they're headquartered in Düsseldorf, their products are shipped out and used around the world. You've been engaged by the VP of Paints and Coatings, whose division, which produces dispersions, pigments, and resins, has been faltering in the face of more innovative competitors. So, the VP believes that a new line of thermochromic pigments that they've recently released from 18 months in R&D may be her key to returning the segment to growth by launching a new line of paints that, interestingly, change color at different temperatures. Given the client's lack of familiarity with the product category, they've brought in outside help to develop their sales and operations plan ahead of launch. For your work stream specifically, you need to help the VP evaluate the 3 available manufacturing alternatives and identify which of those processes to invest in to bring the product line to market.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that question. There's a lot there, and in the paints industry, which I'm not super familiar with, it's going to be a fun problem to solve. Looking forward to that. So just to make sure I've like captured everything, and like I have a couple of questions there. So essentially, our client is a player that works in is based out of Germany, sells around the world. They produce lots of construction material like paints. So just a clarifying question there, what else do they produce?
Yeah, they have a bunch of other things that the whole company produces. That's rubber, adhesives, performance polymers. But we will be focused mostly on the paints and coatings division for this case.
Perfect. So I think that's super helpful. And then like we've been engaged by the VP of paints and coatings, and what she wants us to, and she said that like they're kind of falling behind to innovative competition in that segment. So like they've found this paint that changes color when temperature changes.
Yep.
And they think that is the answer to the competition. And what they want to do is they want to evaluate manufacturing alternatives to and develop and pick which the best one is, and then do a sales and operating plan.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's super helpful. So just to make sure, manufacturing alternatives here, do you mean they have 3 processes and they want to test that, or do they want to decide whether they want to manufacture in-house, out-house, etc.?
That's a fair question to ask. So it's more on the former, but to be a bit more specific, they've got 3 different kinds of products, which also have 3 different kinds of processes that they would like to evaluate.
Oh, very interesting. Okay, so that's helpful to know. And then the second one is, a lot of companies, especially manufacturing companies, kind of have certain KPIs on the back of which they evaluate processes and like success. So does this company have any specific kind of either KPIs or like specific goals that they want out of this process that they're looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask. Yeah, so the company does have a couple of KPIs that they usually look at as measures of success. And those are the operating profit percentage or operating margins and the return on invested capital.
Okay, that is super helpful to understand. So I think I've got most of what I need. Let me just take a minute or so to draw up a structure on how I want to approach the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I have an idea of how I want to approach this. I think I'm going to start with essentially looking at two key buckets. The first one is financial, and the second one being operational. Within the financial bucket, I want to look at three things. First one being the investment needed for each of these processes to set them up. The second one being the revenue, the third one being the cost. Within the revenue, I want to understand like what is the price we can command for each of the product that we can pump out, and what is the kind of quantity that we can pump out. And then within the cost bucket, I want to look at the variable cost and the fixed cost. Within ops, I want to look at three key things. The first one is process management. The second one is like labor management, and the third one is like regulations. Within the process management, I think a couple of things are like quality control, efficiency. Within the human management, or rather human capital management, it's more around like training, admin around hiring, removing people, dealing with unions. And finally, within the regulatory bucket, I want to look at like environmental hazards, given it's like paints, chemicals, safety standards, and also like any kind of certifications, etc., that need to be taken by the governments. And then finally, I just want to evaluate all of this with the risk and reward for all of the processes before being able to make a decision on which one to go ahead with. So I think given that, I'd like to start with the financial bucket and like try to understand, obviously you mentioned that there's operating margin and return on investment capital, which tells me obviously there's revenues, costs, and investment data potentially available. So, if you have that information and you think that's the right direction to go, I'd love to start with that.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have some information around that. But before we actually dive deeper into the actual numbers, the VP has a director of operations, and the director of operations explains that there are three manufacturing processes, which we just discussed. And at the highest level, the three of these work by converting raw material inputs into a finished end product.
Right.
The team has not used these processes before, but they are trying to understand what might be the economic trade-offs, etc. So I think you're going in the right direction of trying to understand the how to get to these pieces of information around operating margins and return on invested capital. But what specific data points do you think you need in order to evaluate the economics of each of these processes?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So can I just take 30 seconds to think about that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I think like looking at this potentially two ways. The first one is on the revenue side, and the second one would be on the cost side. I think just tying it back to the structure a little bit. And within the revenue side, I think what would be good to know is, the different price points or quality of different products that we can charge, since you did mention at some point that there are different products that the processes would throw out. How much of each that we can sell, and how efficiently our processes are working to be able to produce that to sell. And on the cost side, I think, starting obviously with the setup investment cost, and then moving into the more operational side of things, what the raw material cost of each of these are, as I would assume, since the products are slightly different, the inputs might be slightly different as well. The associated labor cost. And if I think about like some of the fixed costs, like what overheads, admin, marketing, etc., that might go into that. So I think, yeah, those are things that I would think that would help me evaluate these processes.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a very logical way of trying to tackle this problem. So now we do have some information from the director of operations who has some peers in the industry. And we have a few KPIs from the industry that are coming through, and we can base our analysis based on these KPIs. So just give me 1 second, and I'll just share my screen with some more financial information, and I'll let you take it from there where you want to go.
Amazing, that's helpful.
Second. All right, can you see my screen?
Awesome, yes. So what I see here is a table, essentially that outlines the thermochromic.
Yeah, it's just that's the scientific term for paint that changes color when with temperature.
Brilliant. So what they have is the selling price of the products from each of these processes, the cost of goods sold and the operating expenses for each of them as well, the capex and the yield. So just to clarify, the yield here means that for, let's say for 1 pound of input, 75% of that can be sold as product.
Yeah, so 0.75 pounds can be sold, yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. And
Okay,
now
I
that
think,
you mentioned the pounds number, another piece of information is like all of these are at an industrial scale looking at input of 100 million pounds.
100 million pounds.
Yes.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. That's super helpful. So I think what I can calculate with this is the revenue that we can make using the yield and the sales price and the 100 million number that you mentioned. I can calculate the costs, which is again going to be the cost of goods sold and the OPEX multiplied by the 100 million, like you mentioned. The CapEx stays as it is. So I think, so I have the revenue, I have the cost, and then you did mention return on invested capital. So I think given that I have the revenue and cost, I can get aka the margin / the profitability for the first year. And given that I have the capex, I can also get to the return on invested capital. So I think I can calculate all these metrics. Is a good next step to go ahead and do all the calculations.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, let's do that.
Amazing. So I'll just outline my calculations clearly and then take a second and run the numbers.
Sure.
So I'm going to start with the revenue.
All right.
In order to calculate the revenue, what I'm going to do is multiply the sales price into the 100 million, into the yield for each of the processes, and I will get the revenue number.
Makes sense.
And as I go ahead doing that, I get 300 million for process A, 270 million for process B, and 360 million for process C. And then to get the cost, what I'm going to do is I will add up the cost of goods sold and the OPEX and multiply that by 100 million. So what I get for process A is 240 million. For process B is 180 million. And for process C, it's 300 million. And given that I have the cost and the revenue, I can get to the profit by subtracting the cost from the revenue. And I get 60 million for process A, 90 million for process B, and 60 million again for process C. And given now that I have the profitability, I can also calculate the operating margin and the return on invested capital. So the operating margin will be the profit divided by the revenue. So just give me a quick second. I'm going to do these calculations. Yeah, so the profit margin for the first one is 20%. For process B, it works out to 33%. And for process C, it works out to approximately 17%.
16.7%. So
16.7. Okay. Thank you for that. And then finally, to calculate the return on invested capital, I am going to do profit divided by the capex. Is that the right? Just to be sure, like I'm not very familiar with this, but is that the right?
Yes, exactly. So return on invested capital, you're trying to identify what is the return and then divide that based on the invested capital. And in this case, that's going to be capex.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. So for the first one, for process A, we get 60 by 180, which is 33%. For the second one, we have 90 by 450, which is 20%. And for the third one, we have 60 by 240, which works out to 25%. Now that I have a lot of the profitability numbers, I think just like taking a step back and trying to figure out what they mean. I do think that, the operating profit is quite interesting because that kind of tells you the health of the business. And process B is obviously quite superior at 33% for the rest, over the rest. And if we look even just at like cost and revenue, it has the lowest cost, low revenue, so seems like a low risk thing, but the investment is very high, which means the return on invested capital is quite low. And like process A has the highest return on invested capital because the initial investment is on the lower side. However, like I think, just given my experience with working in manufacturing or doing operations in the past, one of the important things to look at tends to be like the NPV of a project. I feel like the return on invested capital might be like a very short-term kind of metric. You're only looking at it for the course of 1 year. So I think it like, just given that there might be competing projects, I would ideally look for an NPV. Do you think it makes sense to do an NPV calculation here, or?
Yeah, NPV or net present value sounds like a good idea because yes, as you pointed out that this is a more like short-term approach when we're talking about ROIC. The net present value actually lets us evaluate our investments over a longer period of time and also
Exactly.
allows us to like risk adjust them because not all processes, not all risk is equal, not all processes have the same risk. So we can adjust our future cash flows based on risks and get to probably a more complete number. So I think that's a great idea. So what do you think is the information you need to actually calculate NPV at this point?
Yeah, I think thanks for that. I think the key bit of information I would say that's missing is the discount rate, as the NPV calculation tends to be the cash flows divided by the discount rate, and then finally subtracting the initial investment. So we don't have the discount rate. Do you think it's fair to assume a 10% discount rate as that's the standard like thing that we tend to use?
Yeah,
Or
usually
do we
we
have
go
any
with like a
information?
10 or 12%, but in this case, the director of operations has told us that the process A has a discount rate of 20%.
Okay.
B also has a discount rate of 20%, and C has a discount rate of 10%.
Okay, that's actually super helpful. And 20% discount rate seems pretty high, things that I haven't seen before, but I will go with the director of operations, given he is the director of operations at the end of the day. So I'm just going to calculate the present value for each first and then subtract the initial investment. So the present value for process A is 60 million divided by 20%, which gives me 300. So the second one is 450. And the third one is 600. Just, I can't remember the investment cost for the third one. So could you maybe just flash that back up for a second?
Yeah, 1 second. Let me do that. Share screen. Yep, there you go.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That's super helpful. So that gives me an NPV of 120 million for process A, 0 for process B, and 360 for process C. Interesting. And that kind of changes the dynamic a little bit financially because, like you were talking about the risk adjustment, obviously with process B, there is like great cash flows and the operating profit is great, but at the same time, the initial investment risk is so high and we don't know, a lot about this product. So like maybe that's not the best, idea, even though the recurring business seems the most sound. And process C, which wasn't as much of a, conversation at the beginning because the low operating margin has a great NPV here because the initial investment is not high and like the recurring cash flows are quite good. And the discount rate is the lowest. I think that's a huge kind of lever here with process C. So like I think that starts to become a little more interesting. I think like from a financial perspective, we do have a decent kind of idea of how to evaluate this, but like I think the next thing I would love to look at is some of the operational stuff. So, thinking about like the process management regulations and the human capital management aspect of it. Do you think it's a good time to jump into evaluating the different processes and the quality and efficiency of each of these?
I think that's a good push in terms of trying to evaluate this further, but the VP of the paints and coatings division kind of wants us to focus a little bit more on the go-to-market side. So
Okay.
I'll give you some more context around this. So it's great that we have the financial analysis already in place. But the VP has told us that while they already exist in the market, these thermochromic pigments have historically remained a cottage industry, essentially sold in the form of novelty paints at hobby and art houses for uses ranging from auto body work to arts and crafts, etc. And we believe that the client's new product line can only meet the ambitions of righting the ship for the paint and coating division. But if it can be brought to market differently, we'll be able to
Mhm.
gain scale.
Okay.
So, would you mind just helping us brainstorm what might be some potential go-to-market alternatives for this thermochromic pigment that we choose?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Do you mind if I just take a couple of seconds to think about, or 30 seconds to think about this?
Sure, go ahead.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I think I have a couple of ideas on how I might want to approach this. The first, like, I think I want to think of it from like a business to business perspective and a business to consumer perspective.
Mhm.
So like if I think about it from a B2B perspective, taking some of the examples that you even mentioned earlier, I think our client is primarily focused on construction. So I think like unlocking new markets like potentially automobiles, working or tying up with auto suppliers, etc., to use their paint for uses that could be useful. I think the second one being a bit more in construction, but like looking more at new age construction buildings where you have energy efficiency, maybe using reflection qualities or like absorption quality of paint changing colors.
Mhm.
I think partnerships, something fun could be like partnerships with like a coffee house, like a Starbucks or something, where you're serving cold coffee and hot coffee, and you have these like Starbucks mugs, and like it's quite cool. Like I got a mug once from Bloomberg that basically changed color when there's a hot water in it.
Mhm.
So maybe having a longer scale tie up with a coffee house like that could be quite cool. And on the B2C side, I think more. I think I had two ideas. One is talking about artists. I've currently recently been to like an art installation that was a little more like sensory based with like temperatures and like et cetera, et cetera. So maybe something like that where, depending on the temperature of the day or the room, and like it changes colors, like if there are artists working with certain artists to like promote this kind of paint.
Mhm.
And the second one being like DIY kind of stores where, I go buy my own paint, print my house kind of places. So
Mhm.
potentially working with like a Home Depot equivalent, kind of shop to like sell these products further. So to consumers who would like buy this directly. So I think these are some ideas that I have. Given my limited knowledge of the paint industry, if there's something I'm missing out, happy to like, think a bit more.
No, these are some great ideas. I think these are some solid ideas that we can present to our clients. So in terms of like wrapping up and conclusion, we have seen a few different economic measures for the three different processes.
Mhm.
And my question to you is going to be, what do you think are some arguments for relying on each of these economic KPIs that we came up with? And on top of that, based on your understanding, what would you recommend to the client?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. So just to be sure, the KPIs that we're talking about at the moment are the margin, the return on invested capital, and the NPV.
Yep.
Are those the right KPIs I should be focusing on?
Yes.
Thank you. That's super helpful. So I'd say like I'll start with the operating margin. So for
Mhm.
me, based on my knowledge and understanding, the operating margin is like a great indicator of health of your business every day running. So the higher the operating margin, the healthier it is, the more cash flow it can generate. Um, and that generally tends to be a sign of a healthy, sustainable business. The second one being return on invested capital. This one's I think, an interesting metric because it does tell you like what the return on the capital you're investing is, but from a very short-term point of view. So like I think if you're like looking very short term into the markets or like whatever else have you, I would like think about return on invested capital. But for anything longer term, I don't know if it's the best and most relevant metric. And that kind of takes me nicely into NPV, which is sort of, it gives you the lifetime value of the project, or like whatever time you want to give to the project, it gives you that value. And I think that tends to be a good project evaluation metric, as it adjusts for risk and it adjusts for your where else you could be investing that money, right? So I think that tends to be a good metric. So like, if I had to look at it overall, I would like try to combine NPV with operating profit and not look at ROIC in as much detail. I think I'd like leave it there, but like prioritize the first two metrics that I mentioned right now. And then I think trying to conclude, given all the information that we have from the three processes and the financial metrics that we've calculated, I think if I had to recommend one of these three processes to our client, I would recommend process C for a few reasons. The first one being that the NPV is the highest and it is 3x the next NPV, which I think is, in the long-term sustainability of the business, adjusting for it, is great. The second one being that the operating margin, while being the lowest, is not that much lower than the second one of process A at 20% and process C is at 17%. And the third reason essentially being that it does have scope for improvement given the large cost base that it has and the lowest yield base that it has. So I think in future, as we go up the learning curve, we could potentially look for improvements along those lines and like figure that out. However, obviously, as any process and anything, it does come with a few risks. The first one being that it is the highest price, right? Like we're charging $6, and like I think it's important to make sure that price is correct. The second one being that it has the lowest yield, which means there's a lot of wastage in this product, which could lead to issues operationally and potentially even like, with our costs, etc. So I think as next steps, there's a few things I'd like to do. The first one is like test the market for the price of $6 and make sure that we can actually achieve that. And we can sell the 100 million or 75 million, or sorry,
60 million pounds that are coming out.
Million pounds worth of product at that price. And the second one would be, I think, to figure out, can we improve the yield and reduce the cost over time, and like what that sort of looks on the learning curve journey in the long run, because I think that we should be able to exploit a bit more of improvement opportunities in terms of the operating margin here. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's a pretty solid plan in terms of next steps as well as thank you for highlighting those risks. So thank you for this analysis, Eishan. We look forward to working with you again. Cheers.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the case. It was very fun.
Cheers.
Hey everyone, it's Kenton Kavesti here, the founder of Rocket Blocks. Thank you so much for watching this mock interview video. I hope you found it informative and helpful as you are getting ready to prepare for your own interviews and hopefully landing that job offer you are excited about. We have a ton of great content on the Rocket Blocks channel coming out on a weekly basis, mock interviews, mini lessons, and chats with our Rocket Blocks experts. So if you haven't subscribed yet already, please do so. There is a big red button below. And if you hit that, you'll get all of our content as soon as it comes out. Thanks for watching and have a great day.